Chapter 9. Romans, Greeks, and a Wedding. Shakespeare returned to Roman history for the subjects of his next 3 plays. Julius Caesar had been successful a few years earlier, so the company probably thought that it would be a good idea to continue the story. Shakespeare's source for that play had been the Greek historian Plutarch, who wrote in the 2nd century. There was a very good translation of his work in English, which Shakespeare used. So towards the end of 1606, or early in 1607, he wrote the first of these plays, Antony and Cleopatra. In Shakespeare's time, people thought that the Romans were the most important people who had ever lived. Latin was not needed in Protestant churches, but boys still studied it at school so they could read Roman literature. The work of writers like Plutarch helped them form their ideas about society and politics. Above all, they were interested in the lives of great men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Shakespeare followed his source more closely than in other plays, but he did not always share Plutarch's opinion of the characters, and by this time he was able to turn the excellent translation into the form of language that was best for the subject. For this reason, the language of Antony and Cleopatra, a play about 2 of the most famous lovers in the history of the world, is perhaps the finest and most romantic that he ever wrote. Cleopatra's wonderful speeches make it a very difficult part for an actress. There were no actresses in the theatre at that time, so all the women's parts were played by boys. It is hard to believe that a boy appeared as Cleopatra, but Shakespeare always wrote with his company in mind. In comedies like As You Like It and Twelfth Night, the story gave him the excuse to dress the heroine in boys' clothes for most of the play, and so the boy could use his own voice. But Lady Macbeth, Cleopatra, and Volumnia, the hero's mother in Coriolanus, are much older women. It seems likely that between 1606 and 1608, there was a boy in the company with the ability to play such parts. Shakespeare shows that he is confident in the actors by reminding the audience that they are seeing a play. When Brutus and Cassius have killed Caesar in Julius Caesar, Cassius says that the scene of the murder will be acted in countries, like England, that do not yet exist, and in languages, like English, that are not yet known. In Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare is even more daring. Cleopatra realizes after Antony's death that Octavius will take her to Rome and show her to the ordinary people. Actors, she says, will make fun of her and of Antony, and she will see a boy with a high voice playing the part of Cleopatra and making her, a great queen, look cheap. Some writers have imagined that when he wrote this, Shakespeare was apologizing to the audience. It can be argued, though, that the opposite is true. He was so sure of himself and the actors that, at the most important moments in the play, he was saying, "We are good enough to show you the greatest people who have ever lived." Today, people have very different opinions about Antony and Cleopatra. Romantics would like to give the play the title that John Dryden gave his play about the lovers some years later, All for Love, or The World Well Lost. Others see it as mainly political, like Plutarch, who said that Antony's relationship with Cleopatra destroyed him. This second group cannot understand why Shakespeare allows Cleopatra to compare Antony to Octavius, his rival for power in Rome, at the end of the play, and to say that Octavius's success means nothing. Shakespeare is suggesting that greatness is a personal quality that Antony had and Octavius will never have. Shakespeare does not take sides in the argument. He knew from his own experience that in politics the cool head of a man like Octavius will always beat the warm, generous heart of a man like Antony. He had seen this happen when Lord Burleigh's son, Cecil, was too clever for the more popular Earl of Essex. The play is really about being a star. For Shakespeare and his audience, stars were not, as they are today, actors, pop singers and footballers. They were people with power, kings and queens, lords and ladies. It is interesting that when Antony believes that Cleopatra is dead and decides to kill himself, he imagines that the two of them will meet again after death. He is not looking forward to making love forever. It is important for him that the other great lovers in history will recognize them as the greatest of all. In the same way, Cleopatra kills herself at the end of the play because this proves that she is a queen. She will not let any ordinary person have the opportunity to destroy her. We do not feel sorry for Antony and Cleopatra at the end of the play, as we do when young lovers like Romeo and Juliet die. We can only admire them because the truly great are beyond pity. After this, Shakespeare probably worked on another story from Plutarch, Timon of Athens. The play seems unfinished, and there is no report of a performance in his lifetime. In the story of Timon, the Greek general Alcibiades appears. In the war between Athens and Sparta, Alcibiades was driven out of Athens and in revenge led a Spartan army against it. But when Shakespeare decided to write a play about a man like that, he chose a similar story about a Roman, Coriolanus, instead. Coriolanus is Shakespeare's most political play. In it, he compares the attitudes of different social classes, and so most readers today understand it according to their own political beliefs. This is a mistake because society has changed so much since Shakespeare's time, and had already changed when he wrote the play in comparison with the Rome of his source. When Rome was still a small city-state, fighting against its neighbours, it needed a special group of professional soldiers in time of war. They were similar to the men in films about Japanese history like The Seven Samurai. In the play, Coriolanus is the bravest of them. At the end of a war, men like these were often chosen to govern the city in peacetime. Coriolanus is proud and has no political skill. The ordinary people's leaders attack him. They do not need him now, and he is not willing to tell lies to get their votes. In his opinion, only people from his own class who have fought for the city should have the right to vote. None of the characters in Coriolanus is admirable. Shakespeare gives the people a better reason for disliking Coriolanus than Plutarch did, but shows that they are easily tricked. In all his plays, ordinary people are generally kind and sensible, but when they form a crowd, they stop thinking and become violent. In some ways, Coriolanus himself is like Antony and Timon. They are all men who do not obey the customs of their society and in the end are destroyed for this reason. We can only guess Shakespeare's own political views, but they were probably the same as the views of the parliamentary leaders who rebelled against the king 40 years later and executed him in 1649. Unlike the king, they believed that the people should have the right to choose their leaders. But they also believed that only property owners should vote because other people had nothing to lose. Shakespeare, who owned quite a lot of property, almost certainly agreed. During this time, there were two important events in Shakespeare's private life. In June 1607, his older daughter, Susanna, married Dr. John Hall. Susanna was now 24, and her husband was 32. Hall had studied at Cambridge University and moved to Stratford a few years earlier. He became well known in the medical profession, using plants to cure his patients. He was a serious man and almost certainly the most intelligent in Stratford, except for Shakespeare himself. It is clear that Shakespeare liked him and was pleased that his favourite daughter had found such a good husband. From this time, the main subject of his plays is the relationship between parents and children, especially between fathers and daughters. Shakespeare was probably serious about his responsibilities as a father, and was probably a better father than he was a husband or son. Some writers have suggested that when he invented powerful female characters like Volumnia, Coriolanus's mother, he was thinking of his own mother, Mary Arden. She died in September 1608. Perhaps he waited until after her death before publishing his sonnets the following year, because he was unwilling to let her know the details of his private life. Chapter 10. Return to Stratford. Many years earlier, in 1596, James Burbage had rented a hall in London. Although the actors continued to act at the Globe Theatre, they preferred to work indoors. Shakespeare was again one of the partners when they opened the Blackfriars Theatre in 1608. The other great advantage of a second theatre for the company was that in future they could act in London in winter as well as in summer. Until then, they had only acted at court at Christmas time or in special performances for the law students. At this time, a new kind of play was coming into fashion. The rival company to Shakespeare's had performed an old play called Musidorus with great success in 1607. 2 years later, two young dramatists, Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher, wrote Philaster, a play that Fletcher described as mixing tragedy and comedy. These plays were taken from popular stories, like Shakespeare's romantic comedies, but the stories were more serious at first. They began like a tragedy but had a happy ending. Shakespeare, as always, noticed changes in fashion. Early, in 1608, he worked on a play called Pericles. He never wrote anything as bad as the scenes at the beginning, but suddenly, almost halfway through, the style changes. The rest of the play is typical of Shakespeare at this time. It seems that a man called George Wilkins wrote the early scenes, and Shakespeare finished the play. It was not included in his collected works in 1623, so it is clear that his friends who acted with him knew that he had not written all of it. In Pericles, the hero is separated from his wife and daughter. He believes that they are dead, but meets them again. Their meeting is one of Shakespeare's finest scenes. But the play is difficult because the first half is so different from the second. Shakespeare's next play of this type, Cymbeline, is also rather confused. He was probably not completely satisfied with it, and as usual when he had not succeeded, he returned to the same subject. In the third play, The Winter's Tale, written in 1610, he manages to solve the problem of a play that begins like a tragedy but has a happy ending. The title of this play means a fairy story, the kind of story that people tell in winter to pass the time. The play is about forgiveness for the past, and there are a number of things in it that seem to be connected with Shakespeare's own life. The source is an old story by Robert Greene, the man who had attacked Shakespeare when he first succeeded as a dramatist. Greene's story ends sadly, but Shakespeare changed the ending to write the kind of play that Beaumont and Fletcher had described. Leontes, the king of Sicily, has always been friendly with the king of Bohemia, Polixenes. Leontes is Shakespeare's idea of a jealous man. Othello only becomes jealous when Iago tricks him. But Leontes imagines a relationship between his wife, Hermione, and Polixenes for no reason. After Polixenes has been staying at his court for some time, Leontes suddenly decides that Hermione's unborn child is Polixenes's, not his. Polixenes escapes, but when the baby girl is born, Leontes orders one of his lords, Antigonus, to take it to another country and leave it for wild animals to eat. He puts Hermione on trial, acting as the judge himself, and says that she is guilty. He has sent 2 men to ask the god Apollo for advice, but he does not wait for them to return. When they do, they bring the message that Hermione is innocent. At this point, another messenger comes in to say that the young prince, Mamillius, has died, afraid of what will happen to his mother. Hermione falls to the ground and is carried out of the court. Paulina, Antigonus's wife, comes back to tell Leontes that she is dead too. We see Antigonus with the baby in Bohemia, Polixenes's country, and there is an amusing moment when an animal comes on the stage and Antigonus runs away. An old man finds the baby and tells the audience that the animal has eaten Antigonus. Before the next scene, an actor tells the audience that 16 years have passed. The baby has grown up into a beautiful young girl called Perdita, which means lost. And the young prince, Polixenes's son, is in love with her. His father is very angry, but the young couple escape to Sicily. There, Leontes helps them, and in the end, the old man brings some letters that he kept. These prove that she is Leontes's daughter. The young couple are married, and finally we learn that Hermione did not die. Paulina looked after her. So Leontes finds his wife and daughter again after many years. When he wrote this play, Shakespeare was living in Stratford again for most of the year. If it tells us something about his own life, we may suppose that he became jealous of his wife while he was absent in London many years earlier. But Susanna's marriage to Dr. Hall had helped him to discover happiness again with his family. We cannot prove that this is true, but it is interesting that at the end of The Winter's Tale, when everyone is happy, no one says anything about the young Prince Mamillius. In the play, he died 16 years earlier, almost the same length of time in 1610 since the death of Shakespeare's own son, Hamnet. Chapter 11. Last Years. Shakespeare still belonged to the King's Men, and in 1611 he wrote the last play that is completely his own work, The Tempest. It is another play about forgiveness, and, as in The Winter's Tale, the happy ending is produced by a marriage between the children of two men who are enemies. In this play, Shakespeare found a different solution to the problem of time passing. Instead of having a break of 16 years in the middle of the play, Prospero, the main character, explains to his daughter Miranda how they arrived on the island where they live. Prospero was the Duke of Milan, but when Miranda was a baby, his brother Antonio, with the help of the King of Naples, rebelled against him. Prospero was put into a boat with the baby and came to the island. But he brought his books with him, and as a result of studying them, he now has magic power. Before this scene, we have seen all his enemies on a ship in a storm. Prospero says that he caused the storm because he wanted to bring them to the island. The play is complicated for many people today for two reasons. First, Prospero has a servant, Caliban, who is half human and lived on the island before he arrived. Prospero was kind to him until he attacked Miranda. Second, Shakespeare invented this story himself, but included details from a report of a voyage to America by a man called Strachey. At that time, the English were trying to build a town in Virginia. Some modern directors see Prospero as the villain, not the hero, connecting Caliban with Native Americans. But Shakespeare's island, as the character's names suggest, is in the Mediterranean, not far from Italy, and the subject of the play is forgiveness. Many writers have imagined that Prospero is Shakespeare himself. Towards the end of the play, he makes a speech forgiving his enemies and promising not to use magic again. This was the last play that Shakespeare wrote by himself. He had used the magic of words for many years, but perhaps he had now decided, like Prospero, to return to his family. There, his strength, as Prospero says, would be his own. This may be partly true, but Shakespeare took Prospero's speech about magic from a speech made by Medea in his favourite Latin poem, Ovid's Metamorphoses. In fact, he continued to write for 2 more years with the help of John Fletcher, who took his place as the main dramatist for the King's Men. Only one of these plays, Henry VIII, appears in his collected works. Shakespeare was still a partner in the company, but in 1613 the Globe Theatre burned down during a performance of Henry VIII, and after that it seems that he ended his connection with them. Shakespeare lived quietly in Stratford until 1616, but in March of that year he became ill. He died a month later, on the 23rd of April, just after his 52nd birthday. There has been a lot of discussion about his will. especially because he only left his wife the second best bed. It seems that he first made his will in January 1616, but did not sign it at that time, and changed it when he realized that he was dying. In that time he had a very worrying experience. His second daughter, Judith, who was then 31, married a man called Thomas Quinney on the 10th of February. Shakespeare's family had known the Quinney family for many years. But a month later, another woman, Margaret Wheeler, died giving birth to a child, and Quinney was named as the father. When he signed his will on the 25th of March, Shakespeare clearly thought about this. He left almost everything to his older daughter Susanna. She and her husband, Dr. Hall, were given responsibility for the will. He was probably afraid that his wife's relatives, the Hathaway family, would come to her for money, and Judith's husband, Quinney, was clearly not a good man. He did not leave the second best bed to Anne as an insult to his wife, but as a memory of their marriage. It was the bed that they slept in. They kept the best bed for guests. Chapter 12. Not of an age, but for all time. Shakespeare remembered a number of his friends with small gifts in his will, but only 3 of them were members of his company: the great actor Richard Burbage, John Hemmings, and Henry Condell. Burbage died in 1619. The other 2 are the men who made it possible for us to see and read Shakespeare's plays today. At that time, few people thought of plays as literature. When Ben Jonson published his collected works in 1616, the year of Shakespeare's death, people made a joke about it. They said that Jonson did not know the difference between work and play. So Hemmings and Condell did not expect to make much money from publishing Shakespeare's plays in the same way. They did it as a duty in memory of their friend. 18 of Shakespeare's 37 plays appeared for the first time in the collected works published in 1623. They included some of his finest tragedies and comedies: Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, As You Like It, and Twelfth Night. Ben Jonson often criticized Shakespeare's work in private conversations. He was a great dramatist himself, but he wrote a different kind of play. But for Hemmings and Condell's complete works, he wrote a fine poem about his friend and rival. He compared him to the best of the Greek and Roman dramatists, and said that Shakespeare was the greatest of them all. He was not of an age, but for all time. He did not only belong to his own time, his work will live forever. All writers belong to the time when they live. It is a mistake to imagine that Shakespeare had the same views on religion or politics as we have. No serious student accepts that, and it is a pity that so many modern directors change the meaning of his plays in performance to suit their own opinions. So Jonson was right that Shakespeare was not only a man of his own time, but he was also right in the sense that Shakespeare's plays give pleasure to people at all times and help them to understand life better. This is partly because the plays are full of exciting scenes and wonderful speeches, and the characters are still real for us because they have a special way of speaking that suits them personally. Shakespeare was never satisfied with one form of play, and so almost all of his plays contain something new and different. He studied the successes of other dramatists and improved on them. Finally, He was a great dramatist because he was an actor. In some of his sonnets, he seems ashamed of his profession. He wanted to be known as a gentleman. But his plays are great because he always imagined them on the stage while he was writing, and he knew which actor was going to play each part. But Shakespeare's great ability in the theatre is only part of the story. King Lear is a play that asks the question, what is a man? In this play, Lear realizes that titles like king or lord are not the things that matter in life. He learns that ordinary people suffer in the same way as he does, and that before everything else, a man is a father, son, or husband. Shakespeare understood the minds of men and women and can help us to understand them. Because he was an actor and spent his life studying people and listening to them, he could imagine the thoughts and emotions of all kinds of men and women. He can make us believe that he knew what an old Jewish person or a black soldier thought, although he had probably never spoken to one. He can show us the hopes and fears of an intelligent young girl or an Egyptian queen, although in his lifetime these parts were always acted by boys. And so, if you are fortunate enough to see a great Shakespeare play well acted, this is still the most wonderful experience that you can have in a theatre.